on our way to episode 1000.
Or maybe we're just walking back to episode 0. I'm not really sure how this is working out.
Look, if you figure out how to go backwards in time, I would like to go back to about 35, because I think it's the optimum age for a human being to be. Because you figured out most of the things you thought you knew when you were a teenager. That's all done, and you still have some of your real life left before you get old and cranky, which I think happened to you at 20.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 503 of the Dead Robot Society. I'm Terry Mixon. Joining me, Paul E. Cooley. How you doing, man?
Huh? What? What'd you say?
What'd you say?
What'd you say?
Speak up, Shenny.
I am almost out of audiobook hell. Almost.
Is this before or after you listen to it and find out that it's filled with pops and cracks?
Dude, do not go there. So my hearing aids are part of the problem.
Is it? I wondered if you'd found the solution.
Yeah, I found the solution. There's nothing wrong.
Oh, you recorded a whole thing over and it was not a problem? Fuck.
Yeah, fuck my life. So anyway, sorry about that. Yeah, I'm kind of pissed. Anyway, there's a lot of things I had to go back and fix for Audible, put all that shit together. Now I'm waiting on one thing from Sever Press, and I gotta get the shadowpublications.com version put together so I can start putting that in my store this week before Audible gets it. So hopefully Audible will do get their shit together. I'll have it in my store, and then I can start the podcast. And there will be much rejoicing from a bunch of people who are really pissed at me because I'm an asshole. So that's going on. I started yet another story the other day. I don't know if it's going to be a short book or a long book or if it's going to go anywhere, but it called to me. So
have you told Sue about this? Because Sue's not going to be happy.
She wasn't. And yet she was. She thinks it's a really good idea. So I'm still working on TV4. I haven't been back to Trident in a while, and I'll probably get back to that this week. But man, once this audiobook shit is off my plate, my life will be so much freaking better. I'm already a lot less stressed out than I was. So it's been a long road to get here. So we'll see. This will definitely be the last time I engineer, last time I produce.
I think your life will be better if you can move past engineering.
Yeah, it's going to be better. I recorded something for John Miro for his Far Lost series, and it was a lot of fun because it wasn't mine, and it was like a radio show. So I didn't have to do any narration. There were no like lengthy pronunciation hiccups. And it was fun to do, and it only took about 20, 30 minutes of my time, and it was fun, and it turned out really well because somebody else was doing production. So, yeah, they made me sound good. I don't have to worry about it. Long and short of it is, hearing aids are kind of an issue. So,
damn it, Jim.
And if I don't record with them, then all I hear is this high-pitched tone in my left ear. So I have to make kind of a decision, and I think my decision is I'd rather be able to hear properly and not have to worry about the production bullshit. So after I finish Gare's Inferno, which is the last book I need to audio record, I think my days in the production chair are officially over, at least for recording audiobooks. And then I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to record audiobooks. Period.
Your production time will thank you.
My production time will thank me, yes, because it really puts a major stab into my writing, and I get neither done as fast as I should be. So it sucks. But we're almost over the hump, and once I get this book out there, then I'll have a lot of things off my back and can move on.
What about your writing? Where are you sitting at there?
I got I'm getting not as much done as I wanted to. I had quite a few 1,500 to 2,500 word days, and then this stuff happened and kind of took me away. But TB4 is still moving. I'm just at a very rough part of the book. How do you make a briefing interesting? I mean, it's just so goddamn difficult.
Ask David Weber about that.
And it's a scene that has to happen. There's no way around it. It has to happen.
David Weber's Honor Harrington series has what seems like an interminable series of meetings going along, because you just can't do things without having these meetings in here. And sometimes they do have to happen because knowledge that the reader needs is going to happen in these.
Right. Yeah.
You just have to accept that sometimes that's going to happen. Just try not to go like David Weber, meeting every other 5 seconds, please.
Oh, God, yeah. I don't need that. That's why I'm trying to get it all out in one shot. And there are going to have to be some more, but they're going to be much smaller in scope. You'll know all the characters. You'll have a good feel for what's going on, and you'll see what they're comparing notes about. But I have to remind the readers what happened in all 3 books, because we have all the characters together from all 3 books. I have to remind them what each of them saw that's different that the others saw, because that's also important details. And I have to get the reader on board with all that before we go any further. Because if they don't have that information, then the rest of what's going to happen in this book will make no goddamn sense. So it's just got to happen.
There you are.
So that's where I'm at. I'm jonesing to get back to Trident, and I'm jonesing to work on this new story idea called Static. And I'm really interested in getting back on quantum personality disorder, and really interested in getting back to signal decay. So yeah, a lot of irons in the fire here. What about you, man?
I've hit 85,000 words for the current novel. And because of complications that I've introduced into the plot, I see the end being somewhere around 95 to 100,000 at this point. So there's just going to be a few more chapters.
Terry, you got me to write series. Now I'm getting you to write longer books.
Yeah, well, nobody's perfect.
What do you mean nobody's perfect?
I just thought I'd say that. I don't actually mean anything by it.
You're just a Santa impersonator.
That's true. I should show up in one of these episodes wearing a red suit.
I wanted to get shirts first that says I was stupid, and I wear one that says I was stupid, and then have I don't know, we'll have something in the background saying hi, somebody else. That's what we'll do with Jake Bible. We'll just put a still of him that says hi. I was stupid. Hi.
He'd get a kick out of that, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, he probably would. David Wood, get on that.
Oh man.
Machine.
No, I hope to have the writing done on this book in the next 2 or 3 days. Then I have to go back and read over what I've written. It's still targeted for release middle of next month. So it'll be out before too much longer. And then I can move on to a set of short stories that I need to write for an anthology. I'm already champing at the bit to start writing those because I'm ready to be done with this book. I'm ready to be done with this book. This book has taken too long.
I know that feeling.
It must be finished.
I know that feeling all too well, I might add.
But something the listeners are going to like here is the next thing after this, even though I'm probably not going to finish it before I have to start writing on the next Glenn book, is I'm going to go ahead and keep writing in the Empire universe and try to get these separate plot lines back together again. I'm sure that's going to be something that people are looking forward to.
Since you jumped the shark.
Jumping the shark. I intended to have the separation be a little less lengthy, and it's not worked out that way for me. Welcome to pantsing.
You pantsers and your lack of detail. That's why you get in these situations.
It's totally true.
So,
hindsight being 2020, I probably would have done it differently if I'd have thought about it.
I know that feeling all too well.
Other than that, I believe that's all that's going on in my life as far as that goes. The Terra Gambit's audio version is in audio production. It's finished recording. So who knows? It'll be back soon, I'm sure. Other than that, I just got writing to do. I got to keep sitting down and keep writing, making things happen.
Yay.
And speaking of making things happen, we have a guest coming on today, Paul. Somebody who's going to school you.
School me on what exactly?
School you on your hatred and loathing of fantasy. And yes, I know it's not a thing. I know it's not a thing.
We had to dump the intro for last week that we recorded for this episode. Don't ask. But this same situation came up, and the bottom line is Terry has been slandering me for so many episodes. He's got some of you believing that I can't stand fantasy.
Actually, I didn't tell anybody that at all. They figured it out all on their own. They're interpreting your words for themselves.
Anyway, what's your point?
My point is, we have joining us today fantasy author Michael J Sullivan, who is going to tell us both how to go ahead and write fantasy as opposed to what we science fiction authors think is writing fantasy. So without further ado, let's get to it. And joining us today is author Michael J Sullivan, author of, let's see if I can get this pronounced right, the Rhaenyra Chronicles and The Age of Myth and sequels following. How badly did I massacre that name?
Well, it's actually pronounced Rhaenyra.
Dang it.
As in
Sorry.
rye, the bread, ear, the body part, and that's how you say Rhaenyra. But you're not the first person to get that wrong.
I knew I was going to get that wrong.
Although technically it isn't wrong. I mean, once they put it out there, it's however people pronounce it. You know, it takes a life of its own at that point.
Isn't that your job as the author to provide the pronunciation guide to your
I actually have audiobooks out there that I've gone over. So people, I can tell who has read my books and who has listened to them based off of whether they can spell my names or whether they can pronounce them. And then you get the rare ones who have done both. And I'm like, oh, that's weird.
I wasn't on the audiobook kick when I read the 6 books in that series, so I didn't actually hear it. So I'm a reader part. But those were awesome stories, and we thank you very much for coming to join us. Honestly, you're the only one that can help us now. You're like the Obi-Wan Kenobi, because we're trying to understand and communicate to our listeners how we go about writing fantasy, and we've discovered that, well, we're science fiction authors. So that's not working out so well for us.
Do you really have to put it out there quite like that, Terry?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Please, Michael, educate us.
On exactly what are we talking about? Are you trying to read fantasy?
Let's start off with what is fantasy? When we're talking about writing fantasy, what exactly is that?
In your opinion?
In your opinion.
Fiction.
Okay, we've settled that now.
Okay, so obviously you studied literature in college, right? To come up with that answer.
Never been to college. Well, I did go for a few years for art, but no.
Okay, close enough.
No, most everything I know about writing, I taught myself after locking myself in a distant, cold place in Vermont and reading and writing and reading and writing until finally I apparently unlocked this master, mystery. No, I just never understood genres. Genres, as I understand it, came about sometime around the turn of the 19th century when they were taking things and moving them into magazines, and you had different magazines for different types of stories. Prior to that, it was just fiction. Fantasy, as we understand it today, was originated by William Morris, the invented world fantasy, I should say. That's about the mid-1800s, I think he wrote that. And then, of course, you have Tolkien and Lord Dunsany, and some of the people picked up on it in the 20s and 30s and so on. But, I mean, all it really is fiction. There really isn't a difference unless, of course, you want to classify it differently. And they do it in bookstores. So apparently, if you like one type of book, they try to give you one like it, although no two are alike. And then you have books that start out in fantasy, like Tolkien, and then you move into classics. You have Stephen King, who was in horror, and now he's in general literature. So it's a pretty fluid thing we're talking about here. But for what I do is a very specific topic. I'm writing invented world medieval fantasy, which is a la, Lord of the Rings, J.K. Rowling's, Harry Potter, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's kind of interesting because most people look at Harry Potter as a children's book, but then forget that The Hobbit was too. I mean, they're the same type of story. So it's sort of a fairy tale that for adults, I guess, if you want to put it that way.
So you say invented world as opposed to what, writing fantasy in someone else's world? I'm not sure what that's opposed to. So I'm
as
just
opposed to writing in the real world. If you've ever heard of, say, Jim Butcher, he writes books called the Dresden Files, which take place in Chicago. And you have, your urban fantasies usually take place on Earth. And a lot of what you are experiencing, science fiction, really isn't science fiction either. It's science fantasy. Most of it is, but it's not based on real science. So you're talking about your space operas. I mean, Star Wars wasn't science fiction; it's science fantasy. And I mean, Heinlein's is the Dune. That's not science fiction either. It's science fantasy. So that's just where you have basically machines and fantasy. It doesn't make sense. It's made up for drama. And a lot of times, I think originally it started off mostly for allegory. You have like kind of Gulliver's Travels kinds of things, fantasy, but it's trying to give you a point.
Okay, I can certainly buy that. One of the things I've noticed about when I'm reading fantasy novels is that it seems there is a tremendous amount of world building that takes place. Is that something that you figured out before you started writing in the worlds you invented, or is that something you make up as you go along? I'm kind of a pantser, so I'm guilty of making things up as I go along.
You mean the world that I build the world first and then write a story?
Yes.
Not really. I took a lot of notes while reading history books, particularly Western civilization and Roman history. And I just found things that I'd never heard of before. And I went, oh, that's interesting. And Armenian Domini, who were agents by Charlemagne, who were sent out secretly to make sure everyone was doing their stuff. I'm like, that's kind of cool. I never heard that before. So I would keep notes of really interesting things. And I mean, I'm a dungeon master from long ago. So I would often make things up, and sometimes I would steal from that. But no, when I started writing this story, it was completely story and character driven. And then the world was built to basically support the story I was building. But it's a situation where, okay, so when I first started making up stories was when I was a kid. I would be riding the school bus to school. And I would be bored out of my mind, so I would fantasize. I'd have daydreams. But I could never actually just daydream something. I had to make it make sense. So if I wanted to be the captain of the Starship Enterprise, I had to figure out how a 13-year-old kid could legitimately figure a way to do that. And I would actually work this out. And I would have, daydreams that would last months. So now when I write books, the same thing happens. Before I can have anything in my world happen, I have to lay out a groundwork for it. I'm like, okay, how could this have taken place? And I build enough of it so I can build the story on. Well, if I do a series, and I build something else, like, okay, now I've got to revisit what I did and expand it out, and it keeps getting bigger. But I don't spend years of my life working on a world and then build the story. There are a lot of people who do that. There's a lot of people who do the world building and never get around to the story. Something I tend to counsel against, because there's a lot of people who get so involved in making up this back history that they never actually write anything. And the bad part about that is the world building is often facilitated by the writing. If you're a pantser, you understand this. You learn as you write. When you go about writing something, say, okay, this person has to talk to somebody. Who is that somebody? I have no idea. Let's think. Oh, it's a stable boy. Well, God darn it, that stable boy is a pretty interesting character. Suddenly he's one of the main characters in the book, and it adds on. You have to hit his background. So by writing, it builds the world building, and then the world building facilitates options and access points for the writing. And it kind of goes back and forth, I think.
So what he's telling us, Terry, is that we've been thinking about this all wrong.
I'm used to being totally wrong about how I go about everything, so it's not a surprise to me that happens.
So basically, listeners, just put all those other episodes talking about this very topic, just burn them, shred them. He's destroyed us. We're just not worthy or something. No, you're right. So basically, what it's coming down to is, even if you're creating your own version of Middle Earth, there's absolutely no difference between that process and what Terry has done with his world and I have done with my worlds of Derelict in the Black. So basically, it's just the world has been created, even if it's just an alternate now or a future now. Yeah.
Well, even science fiction, you're doing a lot of world building. I mean, if you're, trying to make up what it would be like, when people get to Mars, you have to envision what Mars is. I mean, The Martian is sort of a fantasy in world building, trying to figure out what would it really be like to be there. It's based off of what we know, and it makes logical sense. But you're going to have to get into that character's head and imagine how that would really be. So there's a certain build. I mean, if you get really far out, you're doing Asimov type stuff. I mean, he's having to build a whole empire. Yeah. I mean, we're talking, a lot more going on, but that's world building, regardless of whether it's in fantasy. And even if you're doing contemporary literary fiction type stuff, you still have to do a world building because it is fiction. It's all made up. So if you're making everything up, you've got to continue to do that. And it's all world building. It's all the background, how the different characters relate to each other and where they live. And it could be a real place, or it could be kind of a real place or based on a real place, but not really. because then you run into problems with, getting sued.
Getting sued is bad. We think everyone should avoid that.
Yes, I would agree with that.
I know that I've been thinking about writing a modern fantasy, but I think that I'm going to bite the bullet and write a lit RPG fantasy first, because that's my current reading binge. I've been listening to audiobooks in that genre for the last 6 months, and I want to write a story in there so bad.
Okay. I've heard those are doing very well right now. Yes, that's being very successful at this point in time.
Honestly, the whether or not it would be successful or not is far from my goal in this. I, of course, want a book to be successful, but I write stories because they excite me. And sometimes I've got to give myself a heart project, whether it does well or if it does poorly. I'm going to write it anyway. So I think I'm going to do that one.
Well, what I would actually suggest you do is what I ended up doing was I wrote the book that I couldn't find, that I really wanted to read. And there's so many, at the time, there was so many books that were all the same. And I'm like, none of these are doing it for me. I want this kind of book, and I couldn't find it. So, well, how hard could it be, right? So I wrote my own, and then it's kind of, that's why mine is a little weird. I mean, a lot of people have said that my writing is very old fashioned or traditional. And I was kind of unaware of the fact that things had changed because I had gotten away from fantasy for many years. So I was rather shocked to find out. I was like, "Oh, this is a refreshing throwback to the days of, Feists and Eddings." I'm like, "Really? Things have changed that much? What happened?" And I went, "Oh, there's a guy named George R. Martin, right?"
I actually stopped reading fantasy about the time of Feist and Eddings. So yeah, I pretty much didn't realize that it changed either. I know that Paul has. I don't want to say he's like the anti-fantasy guy, although a lot of our listeners seem to think he is. Paul has the objection, I think, that of something you just mentioned, that fantasy all seems the same to him. Am I reading that right, Paul? Was that your objection?
And when we were talking about that, we were talking about epic fantasy,
okay,
specifically. Medieval fantasy is just not my cup of tea.
Yeah, it tends to be usually, well, in the old days, it almost always was the hero's journey, which, by the way, was Campbell. But
yes.
But on the other hand, nowadays it's kind of all over the place. I mean, as far as I can tell, most of it's so rooted right now in grimdark that you can be almost certain that the basic storyline now is awful people living in an awful place, and then things get worse. It seems to be a theme.
It's gotten gritty, man. Don't you
understand? That's what it is.
Basically, it's like they're trying to take sword and sorcery, throwing in some Sopranos, some Breaking Bad, and grabbing from all these other shows that were out really hot, throwing it together in a stew and going, here you go.
Yep.
I just want them to go ahead and rewrite Fafard and the Grey Mouser. That's my extent of that type of adventure fantasy.
Yeah, I actually haven't read him. People have compared me to him, and I actually had in one of my first books, I had a reference to the Grey Mouse Inn, and everyone was assuming that was some sort of homage. And I'm like, no, actually, I haven't read those books, and I still haven't read those books. I keep meaning to, but haven't gotten around to it.
I haven't read them for decades, but I seem to I recall them very fondly.
Yeah, I remember when in the 70s I would go to the bookstores, I would see the covers, and I never actually picked them up. But yeah, unfortunately, yeah. So I had read The Lord of the Rings back in, I think, early to mid 70s, and you're old enough, I'm sure, to realize that after I got done reading that, I went to look for something else like that and found not a lot. I mean, most of it was like the Worm Arboros, or the nearest thing was Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, which came out in like 78 or something, which is many years later, but there was really nothing that even came close. So that's kind of how I started writing, because there's nothing there. And I originally did the stupidest thing ever, which was try to actually, do a sequel to Tolkien. And then I went, well, this is stupid. Why don't I just make up my own world? But that would be more actually doing what he did, which is make up a whole new thing. That's when I started writing my own stuff. I'm sure you have the same story.
Well, actually, I came to writing late. I've just been a reader. I only been writing for the last 7 or 8 years. So I finally got tired of not being able to see the stories that I wanted to read, and I started writing them. So I'm late to this journey.
Okay. Well, that's a good way of going about it, because if you want to read something that's not there, there's probably other people who want to do that too, and you'll end up filling some sort of natural, missing spot, and that usually is a good way to get going, I think.
Yeah, I can't complain. It's had me writing full time for 3 years now, so it's working out so far. Fingers crossed. When the most recent book of yours that I've listened to is The Age of Myth. I haven't gotten around to listening to the second one yet, because now I'm on audiobooks and I only listen when I'm at the gym walking, and my fat butt has not been at the gym enough to be listening. It's a vast world with so many elements to it. When I was listening to the book, I was struck by how much detail you have, that I could see where, as the story went along, it could be relevant to things that were coming later on. I'm very impressed with how much togetherness, how much cohesiveness your world has. Kudos to you, sir.
Interesting. I mean, I have 10,000 years of history that I've kind of worked out, not in detail, but in sections. And when I write, I generally don't put that in. I literally, as you know from what you just were describing, that book is a very small book. I mean, it's really about a little village. You don't really go beyond it much in the entire story. You only have a handful of characters. So it's interesting that you got the impression that the world is vast when that focus of that book is so small. I mean, it's almost like Beowulf. And they're saying it's just a small little village, a group of people who are being attacked, and that's it. But somehow I conveyed to you a much wider world. It's
the flavor of it. It's not the specifics of it. It just, the flavor of the story made me feel like that wasn't just an isolated place, that it was a part of something much bigger.
Well, that was always one thing. I'm glad you said that, because that was always something I loved about Tolkien when I originally read him, was the fact that you could tell that his story bled beyond the edges, that you could tell that he wasn't telling you all he knew, because he had a lot more worked out, and he gave you that. Same thing with Harry Potter. I got the same impression that there was more there that you're hearing, and that made it seem much more real, because the real world, there are other things that you've never heard about and you'll probably never hear about, but you kind of hear bits and pieces of stories that kind of go off and then just stop. So you're like, there's more to this world, and that gives you that kind of virtual reality wrap around your eye, to the extreme sides of your vision, so it seems real to you. And I think, I'm glad you said that, because that seems like I managed to achieve that, which was something that would be really good to do.
You did. I love that, and I really can't wait to get into the second book and then get to Age of War and see where, now that the story has been set as it was in the first book, you got to see things are going to get worse from there for everybody.
Yeah, that was a problem, because I was going to write. So when I wrote the original books, there was this background history, this legend, and it was this very sappy love story of how this one person, he turned his back on his own people for the love of a woman. And I remember when I first described that to a friend of mine, he goes, "That is the stupidest, sappiest piece of crap I've ever heard." And I had to agree with him, like going, you're right, but that's exactly how it would have been remembered in legend, because they tend to round off edges and bring it into the most drama they can. So I thought, but I need to tell people what really happened, because I felt like I've been lying to my readers all this time. So I decided to sit down and tell the true story.
Oh, I love this idea, by the way. I love it completely. It's just so much fun.
But it took it took a long time, and I was really going to write 3 books, just a trilogy, and I was going to cover, how this whole thing really happened. And I did, and I wrote these 3 books with Age of War, which is what you're talking about. It should have been the last one. But when I got to the end of it, I realized the war doesn't end, and the whole thing is Legends of the First Empire, but the Empire doesn't come into being at the end of the series. I went, I'm going to get killed for that. People are going to want to actually see the Empire. So I went, oh, crap. Okay, so I have to finish. So maybe I can condense it in 1 book. So I tried to do that, and my wife's like, no, this is terrible. This is like you need to take your time. So I'm like, oh, crap. So I did another book, and I'm still not quite enough. So I went to 3, so a whole 6 books to cover the rest of this rather long war and bring you to the point at which the end of that whole mythological period, because it's kind of falls along lines of like Homer, the Odyssey, that kind of period, Achilles, and that kind of thing. It literally takes 3,000 years before my original book, which would be on Earth time, probably around the 1300s or something. So if you go back 3,000 years, you're in the age of the Bronze Age and Achilles and all that kind of stuff. So it's a mythical time period. So I had to finish that. It took 6 books, and I really only wanted to write 3. And I'm like, I'm going to be in this forever. But they're all done, and I've moved on. So that's a page I've turned.
I remember that you said, I seem to recall having read in the blurb for the book that the understanding of the people in the modern age of your stories of these events in past history might not be quite correct.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I haven't gotten to the part yet where we figure out where their understanding is wrong, but I imagine it's going to be very entertaining when I get there.
And I also I had fun with the idea of origin stories. I had to make an origin story for everything. So I had like one person who read the book that you just got done reading, they're like, I think this is totally impractical because they would have invented the bow and arrow. Why aren't they using the bow and arrow? Like, well, it hasn't been invented yet, but it will. So I had to find out how that was invented and how, iron was invented and steel and all these things. So you have the background. I have it down to the pocket and the button, how these things came about, so that you get a sense of how totally barbaric these people were and then how fast they accelerated once they started engaging with other cultures and they started borrowing things.
One of the things that I've often heard said about primitive people that I thought was very, very telling and something to keep in mind that you did very well, I thought, was primitive doesn't mean stupid.
Right.
And none of the characters in your book are stupid, even though they are primitive.
Well, just as a writer, that's something that I've always found a problem, because oftentimes I feel that writers will, in order to make their main characters feel smart, is they just make their enemies dumb. But they don't usually. What they do is they make their enemies, the antagonists, are really smart to the point where they can never fail. Everything is perfect. And then at some point, there's like a switch that's flipped because the main characters can't do anything right. The bad guys do everything right. And then suddenly, for no particular reason, it just switches. And then suddenly the bad guys do stupid things. So I never could figure that out. I was like, why would you go to that effort and then just topple it? So I do try to make sure that both my antagonists and protagonists are fairly smart. If they all come out dumb, then I have a problem. But that means I've got to at least be as smart as my readers, and that's not always the case.
They're always going to be smarter. They're always
more fun. You get outnumbered.
Yeah, you're way outnumbered. It's a good thing and a bad thing.
True. Which is why I liked what was it? Andy Weir did with The Martian. He actually like crowdsourced all of his stuff beforehand. They went, oh no, you did this wrong. You did this wrong. You have to fix that. That might be the way to do it. Although I have a good beta system now where I actually have like 25 people read it and give me feedback, so they can kind of find a lot of the problems I've made. So that has been helpful.
One of the things I enjoyed about the first book was the mysterious figure you had with the information from behind the door.
Ah, the door. Yes, people have been freaking about the door recently.
I don't know about recently. I've only actually finished the first book, but I could see how it was going to be an interesting part of the story going forward when I read that.
Yeah, there are certain things that I found are really good at keeping readers' attention. One, you have to introduce your main character, tell you who they are, where they are, what they're doing, and what's stopping them as fast as you can. If you can do it in one sentence, great. But you also have to introduce a mystery. And usually you want to introduce a mystery that is just tantalizing beyond all belief, and then don't tell them. Let it go for a while. And in this case, it's actually a major plot point, as you could probably anticipate, because it was introduced so early and so focused on. But yeah, I've had people writing with expletives telling me, are you going to tell me what's behind the door finally?
No.
No, that's
keep you in suspense. So much better. Torturing readers is a secret pleasure that I think we all actually have, because I find myself leaving these little landmines which may not go off for 3 or 4 books, or I laid them in the past and people are still waiting for them to go off. And it's funny to see how many and which people catch on to that and then start asking questions about it.
Yeah, one of the things I like to do when I write is I actually, because, and this is an interesting thing, people will say in my early books, they originally reviewed it and said, your books, they're I can tell everything that's going to happen in advance. and another person say, you know, well, this was so easy. And that person would say about the same thing. I never caught that. So what I realized was that each reader is very, very different from every other reader. So you can never anticipate who you're writing for. So if you made a very, you know, complicated, hard to follow book and you really wanted to make it difficult, a real puzzle, most of your audience is going to be like totally confused. So what I ended up doing was I would build multiple puzzles, some that are really easy so that everyone can feel smart when they figure them out. Other ones which are much harder for those who are going to dig a little deeper. And then there's ones that are really hard for those who like use a highlighter when they go through a book. And then there's those which you really can't figure out until I tell you more, which just drive the really smart people insane.
Yep. So,
but if you give them all something, then everyone feels that wonderful rush of, aha, I figured it out. And that helps make books interactive. It helps make people feel better about themselves. It makes them feel like they're part of the story because they're actually working out the problems along with the characters. And I always thought that was kind of fun for me to do when I read. So that was something I wanted to have readers be able to do.
Yep. When the mysterious stranger appeared, I sat back as a reader and go, I wonder what he's here for. And then every time you would go back to that, I'd look at it and go, nope, I'm not right there. Have to sit back a little bit longer and see where this goes. All of my guesses thus far have been wrong. And that's fine with me as a reader. I enjoy sitting back and watching things develop.
Yeah, my intent has always been, if I can get the timing right for the majority of my readers, I would love for my readers to figure out every twist and turn I put in a book a paragraph before I tell them. Because then they get the rush of figuring it out, but it has that inevitability that, oh, I should have realized that just seconds before it happens. And then they can have that, like I said, it's a great rush when you can figure that out and go, oh, wow.
Is that difficult for you to get into the stories? I know that if I try to do that, I come off sounding a little over clever for myself. So I'm not the greatest at doing that, perhaps.
Like I said, you have to put in different ones that are more difficult to figure out because everyone's a little different. But yeah, I can, after I write something, I'll go away from it for a while and I'll come back and I'll read it. And I'll read it in the fashion that I would read any book. Not at my computer. That's not where I read books, obviously, but that's where I write. So I might sit with my iPad or something and I will read it as a reader. And I can and I do tend to forget what I wrote. I'll make myself laugh out loud because like, that's a hilarious joke. Who wrote that? I'm like, oh, right, me. And I'll totally forget that I did it because I don't remember it. Because if I just write something, I don't recall it that well. If I read it, then I'll recall it. So oftentimes I will write and I'll, 6 months later, I won't remember any of it. And I'll read it and be like, oh, this is fun. And that's when I start recording it in my brain and it becomes more hardwired to my long-term memory. But just writing it doesn't quite do it because it comes in fragments and fractures, and it's not one cohesive story until I read it, which is bad because when I have to edit, editors, I need to have the book in finished form so I can sit down and read it as a reader so I can tell where the slow spots are or where the mistakes are. But oftentimes they want to like freeze the file and you have to only do comments and it's all broken up and it's got editing lines. I'm like, no, I can't do that. You've got to give me a finished file so I can read it, so I can tell what's right and what's wrong. But I digress.
When you're writing a long story like that, do you run into parts where your memory has betrayed you and you've forgotten some element or you've gotten some detail wrong? I know that I didn't have a story Bible when I started writing my series, and I'm paying for that now as I find details of going, oh, I think I changed the name of that planet. Damn it.
Within a single book, I don't, but within, like, as you can tell now, I've got multiple series. And yeah, so the Raya Revelations I wrote 10 years ago, or actually wrote more than that. It was published 10 years ago. So I actually went back and reread it and took notes. So that refreshed my memory on a number of things for the most recent series. And yeah, I kind of built the Bible out of Scrivener by just adding and completing, all my research folder there. But I have forgotten things. A good example, I don't know if you know, what was it? The Winter's Daughter, Disappearance of Winter's Daughter was one of my more recent chronicles that came out about Royce and Hadrian, which was the two characters from my original Rhaenyra series. And I was writing them, and it has to do with the people that they met, the Duchess and Duke of Rochelle. And I had this whole plot laid out. I was going gangbusters halfway through the book, and then I happened to be rereading Revelations, and in the process, I see one most annoying sentence that says that Hadrian had never, ever met the Duke.
That's a complication.
And I'm like, but I have all these scenes with him and the Duke. I'm like, crap. And my wife goes, don't worry about it. They're never going to remember. I'm like, no, I can't do that. Definitively, it's in Hadrian's mind. I cannot change that. I'm like, crap. And this is one of the reasons why I actually write my entire series before I release the first book, so I don't get myself in this trouble. Because I always hate to, think of a really great twist that I can't change because of a sentence I wrote 3 books earlier that's on the shelf. So I try to get them all done first. But you can't write multiple series at the same time and expect to have a career. So as a result, I had to rewrite and restructure that plot. Luckily, I was able to do it, but that was kind of a body blow when I was writing that book. I was like, oh, I can't believe that that's going to make me rearrange the entire plot because of one sentence. But yeah, luckily I did read it.
You should have got to the end and then just erased his memory.
Well, I would love it if my books were like all ebooks. I can surreptitiously go in and change them. And people would say, you wrote, I go check it again. You must be mistaken.
Yeah, there's always going to be there's always going to be the writer's cut where they go back and they fix all the problems they create.
I have that George Lucas problem.
That's going to be our future.
People are going to yell at me and say, you've changed my childhood. And which is funny because now they can actually say that because I realized that my first book came out 10 years ago. So there are people who are like, 21 around who are like 11 then, right? So, uh-oh.
Jump in here, Paul. So ask some questions, dude.
So most of these series, I haven't looked at anything. Most of these series are the sort, when you say primitive people, I assume you were talking about, are we talking loincloths? Are we talking armor? What are we talking here?
We're talking approximately, like I said, the time of Greek club, the classic Greek period of Achilles and kind of. So yeah, some of them are walking around in like togas. Other ones are wearing your bronze armor with your fan helmets and things of that nature. So they do fall into that period. And that's the series that we're talking about, Legends of the First Empire series. The other ones take place in medieval times, like you would, like most of them, princesses and kings and stuff.
So I assume you have horses?
Interestingly enough, in the latter books, the ones that I first wrote, those have horses. But in these books, horses to humans are a source of meat. They hunt them.
Ooh, okay.
Because they've never even thought to ride them anymore than you would think to ride a deer. So they hunt them for food, but they don't actually think to ride them yet. So there are certain things that are, there's no money. There are no cows. They haven't domesticated cows yet. They have aurochs, which are just simply wild bulls and things, which are, you wouldn't want to deal with them. And so this is at a time period, and it's kind of mismatched. Okay, I'm not staying strict to history. So you have some of it is Bronze Year, some of it is almost primitive. Because if you look back at the time period, I mean, you go to England, it would be very primitive. If you go to Greek, it would be a totally different time. So I'm kind of playing with that a little bit. So there's a mismatch between some. It's almost primitive to the age of Stone Age, and then other aspects of it take them to the Bronze Age. And I've always done that. I mean, I have in my original books, it's taking place in a form of like medieval Europe, but they have coffee, and they have potatoes. These things wouldn't exist. They even have sailboats. I mean, you couldn't possibly do that because they didn't have it at the time. But in my world, I even have powdered wigs, so I'm kind of I throw in a little mishmash of the things that I like.
For crying out loud, how much research have you done on all these topics?
What makes you think it did any?
So you put powdered wigs in there, but I have no idea how they work?
Oh, I do. And I actually spent quite a long time just researching sails and the age of sail and all that kind of stuff, because I had to write one of the books takes place on a sailing ship vessel. So I had to figure out what they ate, how do you operate a 3-masted, sailing galley? And like, oh, that was tough because I don't know anything about sailing. So I had to teach myself all that. But yeah, there's more research in this style of writing where it's my own world. And technically I can't do anything wrong necessarily, but you ended up having to do that anyway, because it has to seem real, if nothing else. And that's the trick. you have to, get the suspension of disbelief by making people say, well, that seems kind of real, which is really weird because people will take offense to certain things, but not others. Like, I don't think that person could swing that sword that hard. I'm like, but you believe in dragons. Okay.
Yeah, that's always kind of interesting, and it's the same kind of problem you have with Star Trek fans, for instance. That they'll pick apart one piece, but then they accept all this other stuff as just existing.
Exactly.
We've secretly replaced the dilithium crystals with new Folgers crystals.
Will anybody notice? I want to see that in one of the Star Trek movies. They need to get on that. They go to the dilithium crystal chamber, and it's got a big Folgers brand on it. I wonder how much they pay for that.
I don't even know if Folgers crystals is a thing anymore. I think I've just dated myself.
Hey, at least you didn't say Sanka. See, laughs from, well, I'll laugh and a groan.
We're all old.
You hush your mouth. I'm as young as ever. Never mind. I always
ever as a noun.
Yeah, exactly. I just sit here and I paint my beard every morning so I look distinguished.
Lazarus Long, are you?
So when do you think putting in the where do you draw the line at how much detail you actually add? Like, yes, you know how to operate a 3-masted sailboat, but does everybody
need to know that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a huge concern. In fact, one time for one book, I actually said it in a coffee shop. So I took a laptop and I went to a Starbucks and I sat down and I literally described everything in the place. I described the people, and I just had acquired all this live data that I could use as reference. So when I wrote the scene, I had a lot of it in there, and people read that and they went, this is like really boring because you have tons of information, but what about the story? And you totally lost yourself in the research. And the same thing happened with the boat, is that I had all this cool stuff that I thought was fascinating because I had researched it and thought it was great. But as I got done with it, I went, okay, that was all fun and good. Now I have to back out half of that because the story and characters have to take precedence. I feel the same way about world building, is that world building is only there to support the story. Anything that distracts from the story has to be removed. So I don't write world building for world building's sake. It's only there to facilitate the scene. It's the backdrop. And I've always been the opinion you can take a character and dialogue and a plot, put them in front of a blue screen and film a great story. You don't need the background for it. I mean, look at, was it Lifeboat with Alfred Hitchcock? The whole thing takes place in a boat with probably a black background. So you don't need it to make a good story. It helps, and in some cases it can really make it a great deal deeper and more lush, but you don't need that to tell a great story. So to me, world building is nice, but it's more of a garnish than an actual main component, unless of course you're doing something unusual where the setting becomes a character, but that's tends to be rare.
Where you end up putting a lot of detail.
What's that?
I said where the setting is part of is a character, that's when you add more detail to it.
Right. I mean, you have to reference Star Trek, the one where they go down to the playground, right, where the whole planet is. And then you have a setting. The setting has to be described because that's the antagonist.
Yeah, and it also had to be described as what comparison are they making, or based on what comparison are they calling it that?
I'm not sure I follow that.
Yeah.
You said, well, they're having Garden of Eden. If you were writing a book, if I was writing that story, I would have to describe that garden in pretty good detail, not just because it's hostile, but also because of the comparison I'd be making to the.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And that's when you have to put more into it. But what I don't want to do is like I did, like what you suggested I did, and I think some people still think I did, where I had too much information about a subject matter that most people didn't really care about, that was only going to appeal to a couple of people and the author. And you have to keep that out because most of your readers aren't interested in that. They're interested in the story. And that's where you have to keep your focus. So for me, world building and setting, those are things that it's great if you can do them well, but try and keep them under control, because it's too easy that if you're one of those people who spends a lot of your life creating this wonderful thing, you want to show it off. You feel like you've done all this work. What's the point if you don't show the world all this great stuff you did? But that's not why they're reading your books. And that's what you have to make. You have to bite that bullet and say, yeah, I'm only going to use the iceberg principle, which is that little tiny part on top is what you get to see. Everything else, you're just going to have to imagine because it's not that important. And of course, there are those readers out there who want that. They're like, can you do an encyclopedia? Can you do like the Silmarillion, where you list, the history of the world in textbook form for everyone?
Can I have blueprints of your ship?
Exactly. Good example. But and for some people, that's great. But I think you have to aim for the majority of your readers. And that's what I tend to do.
When I started writing, I was certain that I was going to get lambasted for not having very much detail about setting when I was writing. I didn't put a lot into it, and I waited for the complaints to come, and they never came.
Mm-hmm.
It took me 3 or 4 books to realize apparently I have enough detail. They're not going to come hunting for me.
Well, there is a certain degree. I mean, I've also read things that have a lack of description, which isn't the same thing. They're just people who you leave the reader feeling blind, deaf, and dumb. You can't do that, but you don't necessarily have to build a world. Like, you can describe a room by saying, he smelled bacon and it, filtered light was coming in through a window. None of that is really world building so much as it's giving you a sense of place. So you don't want to leave out description, but you do want to leave out the extensive, so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, and why are you telling me this? Because it's not pertinent. So those are the things you want to kind of trim out.
As much as possible, I try and follow the Jack Webb approach, which is Detective Jack Webb, just the facts, ma'am.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're a science fiction writer. You would.
Well, I mean, even in the alternate history fantasy stuff that I've done, it's kind of the same way. I'm only going to describe something in detail if it is important.
Right.
Because everything else is just kind of a backdrop, and you're going to see whatever you're going to see anyway about ancient. I could spend like 20,000 pages describing Babylon, but it wouldn't help the story at all.
Correct.
So
yes,
that's where I cut it off.
I totally agree with you on that. Yes. And in fact, I've had people say that I was describing a scene in Age of Myth, and someone says, you're only describing things that the characters interact with. Why don't you describe everything else? I'm like, well, why? Because they're not interacting with them. They won't even see it. And I'm writing from the viewpoint of a character. So how would they even know it existed? I mean,
if they want a lot of detail, tell them to go read Marcel Proust.
There you go.
Paul, didn't you get a lot of commentary when you were writing the stuff about the oil rigs?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I got told that I must have researched the ever-loving hell out of it, and that somebody was like, you finally put science in science fiction where I didn't feel like an idiot when I was reading it.
Oh.
Which was kind of nice. But, that's what I try and carry over. I did do a lot of research, but I also have a lot of resources in the oil field services and everything else, because I used to work for oil companies. So that kind of gave me a leg up on that. But the deep sea stuff and all that was pretty fun to research. And I could have put in eons of more stuff in there about that. And I'd happily done it. And all the crap that I've got there, I've got all that research aside there. And now I got an idea for another, deep sea horror books. And now I'm like,
Well, that's the other thing, is that you can stretch it out. You can use those things in other areas. So you don't have to put it all. And with new writers, they have a great idea and they are so impatient to tell you. They want to put everything, not only in that first book, but hopefully in that first chapter. And because they have all this cool stuff, they don't want you to wait to have to find it. So they just jam it in there, and then you can tell it just has this. There's no patience to it whatsoever. You got to let that stuff come in its own time. Then it's much smoother. Because both of you are, I'm certainly old enough to recall back in the old days when most fantasy books, or even to some degree science fiction books, would have prologues. And the prologue purpose was essentially to give you the history of everything, or to catch you up between now and the future time, so that you can start the story. And some people would just skip that because it was like reading a textbook. No one cared. And later on, I think they started trying to just do away with that. But they then had so much, exposition in books, to where you're reading page after page of just history. And I could never stand it. So I actually just kind of would only address it when it came up. And if it didn't come up, I didn't address it.
That's one of the reasons I quit reading fantasy, what was marketed as fantasy at the time, was because of that stuff. I'd go look at the book and it had 7 appendixes. And I'm like, No, no, no freaking way.
No, yeah, I hated that too. And as I don't read, I stringently don't like prologues, and I don't like long exposition. I mean, that was the thing. I would go to bookstores and I'd take off all these fantasy books, and each one began the same way. It's like, in the year of Gargoth, when the Great War began between the, I'm like, is there a character doing something anywhere in this book?
It always reminds me of those movie trailers. In a world, you know, it's just like, why?
Yeah, so I read thrillers, and thrillers immediately grab you by the throat and pull you into the story. It may not be a great story, but you're immediately like, really? What the heck? And you want to know what's going on. And so I wanted to make a fantasy book, like a thriller, at that pace and with that degree of commitment by the author to entertain the reader. I don't want you to have to open the door of this book and climb up through a thicket to take your first glimpse to say, oh, yeah, I don't think I want to come into this world. Or, yeah, this is a nice place. I want you to open the door, take one step and fall, and you can't get back out. That was always my intent. So I try to make it really hard for you to put the book down, just because I want to give you something that you want to know and make it easy to read. So much of the fantasy that I read was written in a very formalized style because it was borrowed from, like I said, William Morris, who then Tolkien took that and he modernized it and brought it into a much more modern language, but it was still the 30s. So it was still fairly formal. So that was mimicked and still being mimicked to this day. I took that and brought it into American Indian, language. So it's easy to read, as if you're living in that world today. Yes, it doesn't feel like a medieval world because I don't want it to feel like a medieval world. I want it to feel like a world that you're living in. It just happens to have those tropes in it. And if you do that, it's so much easier for you to get the jokes. It's so much easier for you to understand the emotions. It's so much easier for you to get into the characters' heads if they're thinking and talking exactly how you would. That's what makes it, I think, much more accessible to readers. And if you can do that, then you're going to have a much better response, both mostly in an emotional sense. Because I can make people cry and laugh within pages of each other. And I think that's part of the reason why, is because I can actually access their emotions by using the same language that they are thinking in their head.
So in other words, it's not like, reading Shakespeare, where sometimes you have to have the modern Shakespeare dictionary with you.
Yeah, or the Chaucer book that actually has two books in one. One is written in the original and one is written in the translated.
Yeah, Middle English versus modern English. Yeah. Let's go back and learn that. Have you ever heard Beowulf spoken aloud? Whoa.
Yes, that'd be fun.
Good luck understanding that one. I don't remember being able
I know that as far as prologues go, I've never been much of a fan of those. I'm afraid that the only prologue I actually approve of is pretty much what Clive Cussler does, because you read the prologue that took place hundreds or perhaps thousands of years before the story, and you go, how the hell is that even going to tie into modern times? So you get into the main story, and then you go, where's this? Okay, now let's see how that tied in.
Yeah, there's certain rules. I think there's only three or four reasons to really write a prologue, and most people don't use that. Most people just almost think that it's part of what a story should have in it. If you don't have a prologue, you did something wrong. And I've never understood too many reasons for it. I mean, if you have a character who does something who's not going to be in the rest of the book, and you're reading through his point of view, you're never going to do that again, and it's absolutely necessary for you to understand it before you start the book, okay, maybe. But usually, if you really think hard about it, you could probably find a better way of doing it. Because I hate a book that starts more than once. There was a great book, The Night Circus, and I read the beginning of it, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was so atmospheric and beautifully, poetically written. I went, this is great. And then that scene ended, and then the next prologue started. I'm like, well, wasn't that the beginning? Oh, so I'll read this, and this part wasn't as good. It wasn't as compelling. It wasn't as interesting. And then chapter 1 starts. I'm like, what the heck? And it's starting again, and it's not nearly as good as the first part. So you had me at hello, and now suddenly you're taking me to chapter 1, and I'm like, oh, this isn't what I was looking forward to. So I was like, it's hard to get a reader to really, get involved in a story from the very first page. You don't want to have to try and do that more than once, because the opening of the book is the hardest thing you're going to write. Doing that more than one time is just crazy.
Yeah, it is a crazy sort of thing. I guess we've been here talking for almost an hour. Do you have any advice for folks that are looking to start writing something of the scale, would you, in whatever way you think is appropriate, that might be helpful for them?
Well, first you get a liquor bottle and you put it in your lower right-hand drawer.
You know, that's what I keep telling them, and they just don't buy it.
Actually, I think it was Jack McDivitt I was on a panel with one time. You obviously should know who that is. Science fiction guy that you are. Joe Haldeman and Jack McDivitt run the same job. And they were talking about the old liquor bottle in the right-hand corner. And they said, yes, we propagate that myth all the time to limit out any competition.
I actually propose that myth because what ends up happening is people buy me more drinks at con.
Now there's an idea. That's a very good reason for doing it.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not good at writing drunk.
Yeah, but if you saw the pictures of con he was at, there is such a thing as too many drinks.
Oh.
I was good. Everybody else around me was bad. I was good.
Feels very guiltily.
There have been times where I haven't been good. That's a completely different conversation.
Is that the one where the dress came in?
Hush your mouth. Just
oh, sorry, it was a toga. Somebody dressed you in a toga.
We're not going to talk about this. We're going to move on here. Move on.
So could you readdress me that question? You were breaking up a little bit when you were giving it to me.
Sorry about that. What I'd like to know is, do you have any advice for those of our listeners that are looking at starting a large scale world, like for how they can get into the project and do better at it?
Well, like I said, what I did, how I started this book series that actually got me published was I was watching Babylon 5 and I was watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I noticed something consistent about those two stories, which I liked. And what the thing was that both of them had they had complete episodes that had a beginning, middle, and an end. But they also had stories that crossed over episodes and carried over an entire season. And then some that went the entire length of the series. And some would end at various points throughout the season, so that you had this constant sense of completion of one story arc while another story arc was also building, another one was just beginning. And it kept you glued to the story, and it had a sense that they planned this whole thing out in advance. And I said to myself, that would be a really cool way to make a television show. And I thought, I had never seen one done in medieval fantasy. That would be a cool show. I've never seen a really successful one done. And then I thought, well, I'm not a movie producer or a television producer, but I write books, so I'll try that. Each book would be like a series, each chapter an episode, and I could build this mystery and have them overlap. But what I originally came up with was, how would I start it? What would be the really cool way of starting something that would get you interested in it? Because again, I was having a problem with the beginning of fantasy books being very difficult. So I just had two guys climbing a tower, and they're going to go there to steal a sword. And when they climb the building, they sneak in. You see this very tense scene. They open the door to where the sword is supposed to be, and instead they find the body of a dead king and realize, uh-oh, things aren't going as well as we had hoped. And that's where the story starts going. They get captured, and they figure out a way to clear the name. It's a very small story, even though the world I had created was massive. And the idea that I was going to create was going to take 6 books long. But I didn't care about that. I set that all aside, and I wrote a very simple, easy to understand story, which was designed so that anyone could pick it up and have a good time. It was a fun little story. It wasn't supposed to be some massive, epic story that, you were going to feel you had to invest years of your life, and there would be hundreds of different characters. You had to keep a notebook of their names to remember who they were. No, it was like 2 guys trying to figure out who set them up for this frame job. But throughout the course of that, you hear things, little drips and drabs. If you read The Hobbit, you would realize that there's some guy, some dark necromancer. I don't know, never mentioned his name. He's down there doing stuff. And then there's this ring, and there's little things are mentioned about the outside world. And slowly you get the impression that there's more there. Just as you noticed when you read Age of Myth, you notice there's more going on, but it's a simple little story. And it designed that so that the reader can have this very fun, enjoyable, comprehensible story in which they get their feet wet in this world. When you get to the second book or the third book, by that time, they're comfortable in the story. They're comfortable in the world. And they're suddenly asking for the answers of all these questions that if you had given those to them in the first book, they would have been like, I don't care, and they wouldn't remember it. If you give it to them when they want the information, if you make them want that information, then they're going to remember it, they're going to retain it, and then you can have a reader who's paying attention. You don't want a reader who's just ignoring you. So my advice would be start small and then build your way up. And you don't have to have the complete world finished. You need to start writing as soon as you can and then add on what you need as you go.
I like that answer.
I like that answer, though. I like it a lot. It's very much like I started writing my science fiction. I wrote the first scene. I knew who the characters would be in the first 2 chapters. And then I just built the world around them and said, what would be interesting here? What could I add here? Where are they going? Why are they going? What are they doing? And trying to answer that story for myself as I was telling it. And it just, well, sort of happened. The story happened when I was trying to walk my way through the journey.
And that's how you're a pantser.
Yeah.
Or a discovery writer, if you want to be a little bit more.
A discovery writer. It sounds so much more snooty.
I don't know about that.
I'm a discovery writer, not a plotter.
I can, the only type of outlining I can do is as I'm writing the story, when I finish a scene, I'll jot down who was there and what they did so that I can refer back to it. But if I try to outline it beforehand, I've taken all the enjoyment out of the story and it's not worth writing anymore.
I've heard that one.
I just need to know what events have to take place in the next 10 chapters because what I've set up. And then I know how the rest of it, what scenes I need to get there.
Oh, Lord, if I only reached the scenes that I thought I was going to have when I started writing a book, I'll get to the halfway point and go, yeah, I'm not headed that way anymore. This story is going a completely different direction.
Well, that's why I do it. Try and do it 5 to 10 chapters ahead with the knowledge that whatever detail I put in there, I may have to move around or get rid of entirely.
Well, the one thing that I noticed when I was first writing was I did the same thing. I was a discovery writer when I started. I think everyone is to begin with. But you start writing, and I noticed that I would get to the halfway point in a number of books, and I would get stuck because I wouldn't have an ending. Famously, Stephen King wrote The Stand and got near the end. He's like, he doesn't have an ending for it.
No, and there's no there.
He struggled and struggled. He couldn't come up with it. He thought, I'm losing this massive book that he spent so much time on. And when you write a book for a year and you realize you're going to have to throw this away because you have no end, it's depressing. So what I ended up doing was I just tried to make sure I knew where it would end up. And you're right, it changes. But if it changes, you just make that adjustment and say, now I know where it's going that way. And then you keep going that way. Imagine if you're going from New York to San Francisco. You start off here. You plan, I'm going to go to Chicago. I'm going to go to Denver. I'm going to end up in San Francisco. Well, you ended up having a lot more fun in Chicago than you thought. You're not going to make it to Denver. You ended up someplace else. But you're still, and you know what? I'm going to end up in LA, it turns out.
And by the way, that's exactly what the characters are doing.
Exactly. And it also confuses your reader, which is a good thing because then they can't anticipate what you're going to do because you don't know what you're doing. One more thing I do, though, is I get to the 3/4 mark, usually, and I will reread the book up to that point just to kind of get a feel for how the reader would be experiencing it. And I get there, and usually I feel that, okay, I have all the structure in place. It all makes sense. It's all going on. But if none of that mattered, what would be the coolest thing I could do if it didn't matter? What would be really great? You know, logic thrown to the wind. What would I love to see as a reader happen at this point in the story? And then I would think of something incredible, something just nuts. And I sit there and go, well, can I make that happen? And I'll study back and I'll trace it back. And what would I have to change to make that thing occur? And I can usually plot that out. And with a couple of tweaks, I can make it happen, which is what takes a story from being a good story and just gives you this step up and makes it a really great story. You're like, wow, because you didn't see that coming. The reader's not seeing it coming because you didn't know it was coming. And you're like, wow, I never knew that guy was going to be a traitor. Or I never knew that was going to happen the way it did. And that's usually quite fun for both you and the reader. It gives you a little goose in the middle of the book that you didn't expect was coming.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good idea. I think it gets to a point where if you do it long enough, it starts to become second nature. It starts to become more of a reflex, especially in suspense. I just know how things need to go in order to get to that ending once I figure out what the ending is.
Right. But if you can trick yourself into thinking, well, that's a good ending, but is there something else I could do that? And I'll think it's not, well, that would be cool, but there's no way I could do that because I already said this and I built this out. Like, well, wait a minute. This is so cool. Can I like change that scene? Like, oh, I have to write a chapter. Yeah, but look how cool it would be if you did it. I'm like, all right, yeah.
Or in Paul's case, oh, but I have to write another book. That's where I end up.
I actually just made a note to myself for the novel that I am probably 80% done with, because while we were talking, a twist like that occurred to me and I'm like, oh, I think I should write this down right now before I forget about it.
Why is it all those best answers and thoughts and solutions to all these little plot problems and everything else, or whatever chapter you're having, occur when you're talking about nothing that has to actually do with it?
I have no idea.
It's just ridiculous.
Or if you're watching a movie or reading a book or driving usually.
Yeah, right before you hit that car in front of you, because the daydream, you figure everything out, and then suddenly you're screeching on the brakes.
Yeah, well, we'll hope that does not happen.
I used to have my best ideas while working, which shows you how much my mind was on my job.
Yeah, been there, done that. Anyway.
Any final questions, Paul?
No, I think we covered it. I love to hear how he thinks about the fictional stuff, that, you know, just writing fiction in general, as well as the tips. Those are things that we've talked about on the show before.
Yes, and I'm a coffee snob.
You're a coffee snob. Okay, we can go with coffee snob.
That's not snobbery. That's refinement.
So the only other question I have is, if you were to recommend a new reader to any of your books, do you know which book you would tell them to read?
Well, that used to be an easy answer. It's changed slightly because my first book, The Theft of Swords, is the beginning of my series, and that's in publication order, which if you haven't read fantasy before, that's where I would direct you to. If you're feeling like yourself and you don't like fantasy, that's also where I would direct you to, because it doesn't read like a fantasy novel. However, it was the very first book I wrote 10 years ago. I've gotten a little better since then. I've actually like to improve each time I write. So the newer book, which we were talking about earlier, Age of Myth, that starts a different series. They don't have to be read together. They are related in the same world, but they are thousands of years apart. As a result, that one is written with a great deal more finesse and flair. The prose is certainly better and a little more eloquent. I've cut out a lot of the redundant wording that I used to have in the old days. I would love to be able to go back and kind of edit my original work, but that's not going to happen because I don't really have the rights to that anymore. So it's not going to happen. But if you're history and you have a lot of experience with fantasy, I'd probably read Age of Myth first. If you're kind of new to the genre, or you just, you want something that's fun to read, Theft of Swords will pull you into the story like a thriller novel. It's simple. It's easy to understand. It's designed specifically to catch readers who maybe don't even like reading. It's designed to make you like the book. Also, it's the worst book of the series, and that was by design. I wanted each book to get better than the one before it. And in retrospect, it was stupid, but not so much because I didn't expect to get published. I wasn't trying to get published. I just was putting this out there for the heck of it. And I hate books that when you read a series, the second one is not nearly as good as the first. The third one, you're like, why am I reading the series anymore? So I wanted it. So I kept all the great secrets and the cool scenes toward the latter books. So the first book is very simple. There ain't a lot to it. You learn about the characters as you progress in this series. So you always have something to learn. It's not just it's not front loaded. You don't get all the information in every book. That's boring. This one keeps building. So that's good for if you're just kind of new to it, then you're not necessarily a huge fantasy fan, or if you just like fantasy. If you're looking for something a little deeper, got a little more skill involved, I would go with my newer stuff, just because that's probably a bit more refined now. At least I think so when I go back and read it.
Okay, fair enough.
And where can people find you lurking out on the web?
Well, I usually hang out at Ryera.com. Remember how to pronounce that? Ryera?
I'll remember now.
RIYRIA, which, by the way, I should say, I actually did test that. I ran it through a computer, and it tended to come out with RIYRA. And I also had it by a focus group of my daughter and her friends, and one had RIYRA and one had RIYRA, but most of them said RIYRA, which was good enough with me because I don't really care how you pronounce it. It's one of those three.
Well, Michael, thank you for coming on and talking fantasy with us. We really appreciate your insight. And I hope that Age of War kicks some serious butt, and I can't wait to see what happens next in this series.
I hope you keep reading.
Oh, I will.
Keep it.
I absolutely will. Folks, if you have anything that you'd like to tell us about this show, go ahead and send us a note at show@deadrobotsociety.com. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/DRS podcast. You can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/DRS podcast. But if you actually want to talk with us, go to Facebook, go to the Listeners of the Dead Robot Society Facebook group, and that's where all the cool kids and listeners hang out. And we're talking writing all the time there. Lots of good community there. You'll enjoy it. We, of course, have to thank the good folks at podhoster.com who host all of the episodes in audio for your pleasure. More than 500 now. We've apparently been around for a little while. Paul, if you would, go ahead and let us know who our $10 patrons are this week.
And this week's $10 patrons are Sue, you're writing What Now, Bayman? JD Barker, Kelson Von Deal, Isabel, I forgot to change this for way too long. Oops, Cushy. Rick, getting re-energized at SBWC Shaw. Lisa Slack, Sandy Manpants, Sherelle Winners, FKA on Manatsu. Tracy Bodine, John Kilgallen, Devin Lee, Nathan Six Sick Hicks, Nick Six Slick Bricks with Picks and Sticks Petty. Drew the Black Five Revenge of Chuckles Bernardi. Chris Winder, Andre Conde Moraes, DJ Chamberlain, JRSGU is Awesome Hanley.
He's a lying sack of shit.
No, it just reveals his poor taste.
Ooh.
But then again,
you're saying all of his taste is in his mouth?
Oh, I was thinking more of his skull, but that's beside the point. Anyway,
we really appreciate you working with us with all of our chaos. Thank you very much, Michael.
Not a problem, guys. Thanks for having me.
Go ahead and pass my regards on to Robin. I hope she's doing well.
She's swimming in a pool at the moment.
You can't go much wrong from that.
That's true. All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. Take care.
Have a great day, sir.
Bye-bye.